There's always an inherent bias to these style of lists on YouTube. Bias in terms of the curator's preferences or games they've played the most. And my list of the top 10 open world PvP MMOs had some of that. And with that list, I wanted to showcase MMOs that are still playable in some form, and the focus of those MMOs was on open world PvP. With this list, I'm going to try to remove as much bias as I can, and there's no real rules for this list. It does not matter if the game no longer exists, it does not matter if the PvP is open world or instanced, or if I even played the MMO. I've gone through your comments in the last video and added in MMOs that previously did not make the cut, but should have, and done even more research. With that said, let's start with our 3 honorable mentions. Blade & Soul's an MMO that had a great 1v1 arena system at its peak, but it didn't have much beyond that, and 1v1 PvP is not really a staple of the MMO genre. Project Ascension is a very interesting World of Warcraft private server that has added a lot of interesting PvP features that frankly you don't see in most other MMOs, and in many ways it is so different from WoW that I almost view it as its own unique MMO. I almost put Runescape in the top 20 due to its sheer longevity, having been released in 2001 and still being very popular. Few MMOs have had the same level of success for as long as Runescape. Now the PvP is not its best feature by any means, but there are a decent amount of players that still enjoy Runescape's PvP. Most Runescape PvP happens in the Wilderness Zone, which has different flagging states that one can choose. The Skulled flagging state does allow you to drop gear when killed. And now we get to the top 20 list. Number 20 is Wildstar. This game could easily be higher on this list if it still existed. It did have one of the better implementations of an action combat system that I have seen in an MMO. The battlegrounds and arenas were enjoyable, but the telegraph system did make for a mess in larger scale PvP, with telegraphs completely covering every inch of the ground. It didn't really do anything different from other theme parks in terms of PvP, and the game was short-lived, but the combat alone, I think, puts it on this list. New World is one of the few newer MMOs to make the list. It is also one of the few MMOs that has action combat, and it does have a beautiful modern world. The PvP options include 50 vs 50 wars over control of territory on the world map, 3v3 arenas, and one battleground called Outpost Rush. There is also open world PvP flagging and a new way to handle war declarations introduced in the latest expansion called Influence Races. The PvP does seem to be improved with the expansion launch, so this MMO might be climbing on future versions of this list if I ever get around to making another version of this list. Darkfall Online is one of the hardcore full loot PvP MMOs on this list. There have been many different iterations of Darkfall and none have stuck, but the game was fun for a bit when it did have players. It did have action combat and your typical grindy progression systems seen in most MMOs of this type. It was certainly a game that you had to have a group or you would have a very bad time. Tibia is another very old MMO which released in 1997, which is common on this list and alludes to the state of PvP in modern MMOs. PvP has had different variations in the history of Tibia. In the beginning, there were no PvP servers and there were no penalties for PKing, so PvP was particularly brutal in Tibia. Later, they added hardcore PvP servers with a karma system called the Skull system and optional PvP servers. Aion is the first of many NCSoft titles to make this list. This MMO had a lot of PvP options, but the most common place to find PvP going on was found in the Abyss Zone, which they called a PvP-VE area. This was a 3-layer zone that had instances, fortresses, and many other objectives. Aion's flight mode was available in the zone as well, which was another core feature of the game. Mortal Online 2 is another hardcore, full loot sandbox PvP MMO making the list. It features action combat, player-built housing systems, a robust crafting system, basically your typical PvP sandbox features. It is one of the few newer MMOs on this list, having released in 2021. It is getting a big Unreal Engine 5 upgrade this year as well. Shadowbane is another very old school MMO that released in 2003. This MMO might in some ways be a predecessor to Ashes of Creation's node system, except in Shadowbane the player built cities were full on sandbox created cities. Players could then siege each other's cities. The brutal open world PvP and destruction combined with the many bugs in the game did lead to it eventually shutting down, but you can still experience the game again on the Shadowbane Reforged private server. Yes, there is a Shadowbane on Steam, as Chang Yu did buy the rights and relaunch the game, but I cannot recommend that version. Ultima Online is yet again another very old school MMO. This is one of the first MMOs ever, having released in 1997. The original base game had brutal, open world full loop PvP with minimum restrictions. Over the years they have added different rule sets with options for less brutal PvP. The game is still around and still has a fairly active community when you consider its age. You can still play on the official servers or one of the countless private server options. Asheron's Call is, you guessed it, another very old MMO that released in 1999. This MMO had different rule sets. The PvP servers were called Darktide, but even on the PvE servers, players could flag for PvP. On the Darktide server, all players were flagged for PvP. It did not have full loot, but there was some partial gear looting. The combat was somewhat revolutionary at the time, with a positional action combat style with projectile collision that was not common at all in MMOs of that time period. Asheron's Call has been shut down for many years, but there are some private servers that are available. Albion Online is one of the few newer MMOs on this list. This is an isometric perspective sandbox MMO with cross-play between PC and mobile versions. PvP in Albion is zone-based, with the black zones flagging everyone for PvP and players dropping everything on death. There are also some instance PvP options as well. Albion maintains a fairly healthy player base and is one of the few MMOs that actually has seen an increasing population post-launch. Elder Scrolls Online is also, at least in MMO terms, relatively new compared to most MMOs on this list. Based on the iconic Elder Scrolls franchise, this MMO features both instance PvP and open world PvP in Cyrodiil. Cyrodiil PvP is based on the iconic Realm vs. Realm PvP found in Dark Age of Camelot. Lineage 2 is another old school MMO that released in 2003. This MMO has spawned several other MMOs with similar PvP styles over the years. This MMO has fully open always-on PvP with a karma system that punished griefers. It featured a lot of guild controllable objectives throughout the world, such as castles, and the open world bosses could be contested in PvP. Guild Wars 2 is another newer MMO that features both instanced and open world PvP options. The instance PvP is basically a capture point style arena, whereas the open PvP is called World vs. World and is another iteration of Dark Age of Camelot style PvP. Black Desert Online is a newer MMO that includes a lot of different instanced and open world PvP options. The open world PvP unlocks at level 50 and can only take place outside of the safe zones, which are the towns and cities. Other than those areas, PvP is fully open and you can attack anyone, but there is also a karma system. Black Desert Online is well known for having one of the most beautiful worlds, character creators, and is one of the few MMOs that have a good action combat system. Planetside 2 is the only FPS MMO to make the list. This MMO also follows the Dark Age of Camelot 3-faction open world PvP formula. Planetside 2 is most known for its absolutely massive battles, with an FPS record of over 2,300 players involved in one battle simultaneously. It's hard to make an MMO list without including the juggernaut of MMOs, World of Warcraft. At the original launch, there was basically no PvP content, but over the years, WoW has grown to have perhaps the biggest instance PvP scene of any MMO, with a fairly large Arena World Championship tournament every single year. Next we have Archeage, a game that has relaunched and failed countless times, but the systems in this game were absolutely fantastic despite the mismanagement of the developer. The open world PvP with the trade pack, and especially the naval PvP, were all so well done. The combat was one of the better combat systems in the genre, but the game did have many problems, which is why it is not higher on this list. A true successor to the Archeage style, if done right, could absolutely be a big success. Next we have the most successful PvP sandbox of all time, EVE Online. This game still maintains a healthy player base despite its age. This game is most well known for its massive PvP battles that resulted in mind-numbing levels of real-world value being wiped out. The largest EVE battle involved over 7,500 players and wiped out 11 trillion ISK, which is estimated to be worth roughly 400,000 US dollars in today's terms. And now we get to the number 2 PvP MMO all-time, Warhammer Online. While this game is shut down, there is still a very active private server running. This MMO was heavily inspired by the studio's previous MMO, Dark Age of Camelot, with its realm versus realm PvP, but with some modernizations and a few twists on the old formula. It didn't quite do things as well as Dark Age in terms of how the realm versus realm PvP worked, so that's why I have it at number 2. And of course, number 1 is Dark Age of Camelot. This MMO has spawned countless copycats, many of which appeared on this list. But in my opinion, none of them did it as well as this game did it. And this MMO is still available on both official and private servers, which is a testament to its popularity despite it releasing in 2002. A true successor to this MMO is needed, and hopefully one day we see that happen. And that concludes my list of the top 20 PvP MMOs. I want to end by talking a bit about the future. There are some very solid projects on the way that I think could really improve things for us fans of PvP and MMOs. Ashes of Creation is along similar lines as Lineage 2 and Archeage in terms of how it approaches PvP, along with some new innovations and modernizations. Pax Dei is basically a low fantasy third-person perspective medieval version of EVE Online with zone-based PvP, perhaps similar to Albion Online from how they have described it so far, and to me it is also very promising. Archeage 2, maybe the devs have learned this time? Probably not, but we can at least dream that maybe they have. Then there is even an upcoming MMO almost no one talks about, made by the lead developer of Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies, called Playable Worlds. Given the history of these games and that this is a sandbox MMO, it would not be surprising if it has good PvP systems, but we do not know anything about this MMO yet. And then there's Camelot Unchained. If this game was actually on a path to release, I would hold it above Ashes of Creation, possibly in terms of my interest level, because of Mark Jacobs and what he has done in the past with creating stellar PvP in prior MMOs. But the odds of Camelot Unchained ever releasing are not good at all, unfortunately. For me, this is one of the bigger disappointments in the history of MMOs, the current state of Camelot Unchained. I often hear that the MMO player's down bad, but I think if you're a fan of PvE primarily in MMOs, like most people are, the genre is not in that bad of a state. But for us PvP fans, things are pretty dire, in my opinion. Hopefully at least one of these upcoming MMOs is a hit and the genre can be renewed again. That's all I have for this one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.